Welcome back to the Governor's Institute's Addiction Medicine podcast and the final episode in our Tarang series, exploring culturally responsive approaches to substance use and mental health in Asian American and Pacific Islanders communities. I'm your host, Pooja Mehta, creator of Tarang. Throughout this series, we've talked about stigma, barriers to care, and what culturally responsive support can look like in practice. Today, we're centering lived experience and hearing directly from Saisha Joshi and Reed Bowman, two individuals whose recovery journeys reflect the complexity of identity, culture, community, and healing. We'll talk about how substance use was viewed in their upbringing. We'll talk about what helped and sometimes didn't help when seeking care. And we'll talk about what creating a more supportive culture around recovery could look like moving forward. Saisha, Reed, thank you both so much for being here. Can you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your background and journey to recovery? And Reed, I'll have you go first.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Pooja, for having us here today. So my name is Reed Bowman. I am 27 years old. Yes, I'm 27. I am Korean Caucasian. I was actually born in Arkansas, but adopted from birth and raised in Santa Clarita, California, which is just outside of Los Angeles. And I was raised in an all-white family, so I'm the only person of color in my very large extended Southern family. Even though I was born in California, my mom's side of the family and my dad's side of the family were all here in North Carolina, some were in Texas, some were in South Carolina, so very Southern, down through the roots. And for me, I think growing up, I was always very straight edge. Throughout high school, I was very, I would not say that I was a disciplined child, but I will say that I was very, like a straight A student. I certainly had my own struggles with ADHD. I received my diagnosis in, I want to say maybe fourth or fifth grade, which the diagnosis journey itself is such a challenge. And so I have lots to say on that as well for another podcast, maybe one. But I think when I got to college, I was 17 years old. So I turned 18 at the end of my freshman semester. And what I really struggled with is that I left a very structured, disciplined environment from high school and got to college and found that I was lacking in self-discipline skills and was very... I don't know. I partied a lot. I went to Tulane University in New Orleans, which was a wonderful, wonderful place if you want to go somewhere where you don't need to have a lot of discipline. And I think that I struggled a lot with my identity as like a college student in America in New Orleans, and as a queer person going to different queer spaces where a lot of it was focused on like partying, drinking, and substance use. And I found that I had a lot of trouble balancing that with what I was actually there to do, which was to study, to learn, to grow, and mature. And I think that it didn't even click to me that it was an issue until actually the pandemic started, when I graduated in 2020 and moved back in with my parents. They had since moved to Raleigh, so I moved in with them there. And my drinking behavior continued as if I was still in college, even though I had nowhere to go. There was no socializing to happen. And I had a really, really scary couple of weeks where I was probably the most unhappy I've been in my life. And it took like a kind of like come to Jesus moment, to put it with an idiom, whatever. To kind of realize that I was, it was actually it was hurting myself. It was almost like a form of self-harm in a way, where I was not processing emotions and instead turning to drinking and alcohol, and telling myself, I'm just a college student, it's fine. But after a while, you're not always a college student, and even in college, maybe there's a culture there that needs to be further examined.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much for sharing that, Reed, and for being so open and vulnerable with us. Saisha, same question. Would love to have you introduce yourself and share a little bit about your journey.
My name is Saisha. I I mean, that's probably my background, but I am Indian with very strong Nepali roots because we're up in the Northeast. Um, so yeah, I mean, that's the culture I more so grew up in. I'm 22 years old now. Currently, I work as a peer support specialist, but I'm also conducting research on substance use in adolescents, which is pretty cool. And so hopefully, I mean, that's gonna like find interventions and stuff. So that's been pretty neat so far. But yeah, overall, with my experience with substance use, it's really funny because I feel like I associate a lot with what Reed just said. I mean, I didn't get diagnosed until a lot later, but ADHD was definitely a big part of, I mean, I think there were certain behaviors there that were addictive, not even related to substances, but I think it did definitely make me a bit more vulnerable towards it. But I mean, I think my journey with substance use kind of started in college. I had briefly started drinking the summer after senior year of high school and like around then. But I mean, I think that also picked up, but I think it was less, um, I mean, in a way it was similar. I mean, there were a lot of frat parties and stuff that, I used to go visit with friends, and so I started drinking there. But I think it was a specific group of people that I ran into that were very heavy on drinking and using other substances, stuff of the sort. So I think eventually that got to be a bit of an issue for me, and I also started dabbling in prescription medication, and so that kind of ended up snowballing. And I didn't necessarily know how to stop, I guess, because I think with alcohol, I think a lot more people are prone to being or struggling with alcohol addiction because it is something that's just so accessible to the widespread public. But it's like for medication, it feels a little bit more isolating because then it's like, what now, So I think for a while, I mean, I wish I could say that it like something really awesome changed that caused me to go sober,
Yeah.
but it really didn't. I mean, I think it was just one day I was like, I mean, I have a future goal in mind, and I feel like if I keep going down this path, like, it's just not going to work out that way. So I really did have to put in a lot of effort into that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, I think it's been 2.5 years since um, I stopped counting after a while, to be completely honest. But yeah, I mean, it's been quite a while, and like I said, I think substance use has become a very big interest of mine after that. So I think hopefully I would continue to kind of find ways to make that less likely for our next generation that's coming in.
So, Saisha, you were raised in, like you said, an Indian Nepali household. How were substances regarded in your upbringing? Because you mentioned like you didn't really drink until like the summer after high school. Like what was the conversation around substances like as you were growing up, and how did that affect your both substance use in college and then like, journey to sobriety?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would say it is a lot more common than people think, for sure. I think substance use is a really big word where it's like, at least when I'm talking to my family about substance use, like, they picture someone who might be like houseless out on the streets, like struggling with addiction there. And obviously, I mean, there are people who are at that point, but it's like a big spectrum of where you end up. And I think there's a lot of people who do struggle with substances who also can come off as very functional too. And so I think in retrospect, after that whole thing, I mean, I looked a bit more at my family, and like my grandfather had, um, an alcohol addiction. I am not sure where he is in that whole realm at the moment, but I know that is definitely something that was a big struggle for him earlier on. But yeah, I mean, I've heard of people in my family not being able to quit and kind of like consistently having that reliance on substances or alcohol and that kind of stuff. But I feel like it was always brushed over. It was kind of like, oh, well, he just drinks a lot. And then like that was about it. And so not that that's necessarily a wrong way about of going about it, but I guess I that didn't really tell me too much about substance use, and that kind of left all of the knowledge I gained to my own research, essentially. So like I had to learn all of that stuff from scratch because there's a big difference between I don't know someone struggling with alcohol and it being framed as like oh he just drinks, you know. And so yeah, I mean it wasn't very like talked about. So I was in that same position, and then it was like, man, I feel like I'm not bad enough to really like go be seeking help right now. I'm not like in that situation where I'm like losing my friends, my family, my job, all of that stuff. Like I'm doing pretty good, all things considered. So it definitely did feel a bit like it wasn't like a big enough issue to go seek help for. But I think the end of your question also had something like I think I'm missing out on a little section if you want to repeat that
Yeah,
last bit.
you know, so for your journey into recovery, like, did you seek any help? Did you seek any resources? And, how do you think your cultural upbringing really influenced that decision?
Yeah, I guess I didn't really seek resources within, or I wouldn't say that. I think another factor that kind of played into it is, at least with Indian and Nepali families, I can't speak for like other Asian communities necessarily, but I think there's a big culture of like, oh, other people. Like you kind of have to exist in a space that makes other people comfortable with how you are all the time. And it's like, your whole life is kind of based on others' perceptions. And so I think that was also because I mean I think I had also dealt with well I still do, but a lot of social anxiety throughout my whole life. And so I think substance use was also a way to cope with that. And this isn't like I guess directly correlated to substance use, but I think coming into college and being able to interact with more people who are Indian, who are Nepali, and like proud of that and proud of their respective identities within, being Asian and also, I mean, yeah, and like people who are pursuing unconventional paths in life that might be kind of frowned upon in our community. So I was like looking at those people and I was like, wow, I mean, I think it is possible to have a strong sense of self-identity and also be Asian, like I don't have to cater to everyone's needs all the time. And I think that indirectly definitely did help me a little bit more with that anxiety, which in turn, I guess, made it easier to not like use substances to cope. Um, yeah, and I'm not sure if that's like necessarily like super like answers the question super well, but
I think it does, right? And I think it's really interesting, you mentioned a couple things about your upbringing and we know addiction has a genetic component and it sounds like there are a lot of people in your family who have struggled with this maybe not a lot but at least like a few members of your family that have struggled
Mhm.
with it, like because we didn't like you didn't have that wasn't ever named, right? It wasn't really something that you were thinking about, right? Like as you were talking, I was thinking about one of my white friends who he has never drank because he knows that he has a very strong family history of addiction. And he
Mhm.
was like, I'm simply not, I'm not even gonna try. But, you never had that knowledge. You never were aware that, like, oh, this might be something that I'm inclined towards to even kind of like preemptively not engage if that was a choice that you wanted to make.
Mhm.
And then, the second thing that was really fascinating to me, so in the last conversation we had with the clinicians with Marielle and with Noelle was talking about how the conversation about addiction and substance use disorder, it never really comes up in our communities until it conflicts with productivity. And you hit on that
Mm-hmm.
too, right? Where addiction is equated to you don't have a house, you don't have a job, you don't have friends. And even for you, it was like, oh, seeking, I don't really need to seek help. Or maybe I don't need to seek help because I'm not kind of in that quote unquote decline.
Hmm.
But there's a whole swath of like middle ground where it's like, no, it can still be problematic. It can still be like something that you don't want to do, even if it's not interfering with productivity or with external output or with the way that other people really perceive you.
Hmm.
So that was just a really cool like through line that I was seeing. So Reed, for you,
Mhm.
you know, you're Korean American, but like you said,
Mhm.
you were raised in a white Caucasian environment. And but now you're working very closely through UCA Waves with the Chinese community. I'm wondering, you know, similar to Saisha, like what are your perspectives on like how substances were regarded in your upbringing, how your background affected seeking help, and then, you know, even now when you've shifted into a space that is more like culturally Asian, are you seeing any differences between like the way that you grew up and the spaces that you're in now?
It's very interesting that you say that. And even before that, I do want to say, to a point that Saisha and you both made about genetics, it's so interesting because I didn't, being adopted, it was a closed adoption. I did not have access to any of the adoption records or anything until I turned 18. And even then, by that point, I was like, well, I've already made it this far without knowing. I'm too busy. I don't need to go through all that's a lot of paperwork.
Yeah.
I recently went through it and I found that in my birth mother's application, she had to disclose any sort of family history of anything. And she disclosed that when she was a young woman, she had to go through a program for addiction rehabilitation.
Oh,
Um,
wow.
and I was like, oh, okay,
Like this.
okay. Like, okay, I'm seeing it now. And so I just think that that's really interesting. And I think that if I had known that, every time I went to the doctor for like anything and starting Adderall or anything, they were like, all right, any family history of anything? And I'd shrug my shoulders and say, I don't know. Who knows? Probably, maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
Um, but and family history has never been anything that has influenced my decisions. And knowing it now, I'm like, okay, if I had known that, growing up, like, would that have changed the way that I have approached my first couple of months at university, or is that, how would that have changed, or would that have kind of played into my decisions as well? Probably, I would say probably not, because I also, I also was pretty determined to have a good time. But I think in terms of culture and upbringing, I remember I would say that my upbringing was very different from even the white families in my neighborhood and in the surrounding Santa Clarita area. Um, and even there were a lot of Korean Americans in Santa Clarita as well. Um, One thing I will say is that Santa Clarita is much more conservative in its values compared to the rest of Los Angeles County. Um, Very much more so. And so I think growing up with a Southern family compared to a Southern California family,
Very different vibes.
very, very different vibes. I remember growing up, I was the only kid in the class that said yes, ma'am, yes, sir, and I knew that I'd get in trouble if I did not say those. To all the adults, it was always like, "Thank you, Mrs. Taylor," or blah blah blah. My my mom found the only cotillion place in all of Southern California, and I went to cotillion for a little bit. I had no idea what was going on during it, but we had good food during it. And so I think that like in terms of like discussions around substance use and just kind of like overall behavior and we never fully discussed like, okay, like what's right and wrong, blah blah blah, about substances, or like that my parents were never concerned about like, oh, are you gonna go hang out with these people, like are you like what are you all going to get up to? Because I was such a nerdy closeted choir kid, and they knew that when my friends and I got together, we weren't going to be drinking. We were going to be like seeing how many mandarin oranges we could eat in 10 minutes. And so, like, I don't think that they had any worries about it. But, I was certainly aware of friends in that group that out on their own time or in other small circles, were drinking or were smoking pot. And to me, I was very like clutching my pearls at the idea. Um, and I think I had my first drink at a after work party the summer after I graduated high school. A good friend of mine and we were working at a summer camp and we had an after work party. And the two of us had like a quarter shot of whiskey because we were like, we've never drank before. And then I went home because I felt really guilty and really bad. Um, but then, so I think growing up, like my parents, but I was surrounded by the DARE program, everything. Like I was just like, oh, it's so bad, and I actually held a lot of judgment against my friends who did imbibe because I was like, gosh, don't you want to be successful? Don't you want to be blah, blah, blah? Like it's not something that I hold now, but it was just kind of like that's the vibe that I kind of absorbed from everybody around me. Is just like, hey, why would you want to do that when you can do so many other great things that are productive or that are it just didn't make sense to me. And then I got to college and I was like, well, I'll just loosen up a little bit. And, to an extent, I think not having any experience or being even in environments where I was peer pressured, kind of worked as a detriment against me because I got to my first college party. Someone handed me a solo cup and said, here, pour yourself a shot. I said, how much is that? And they said, it's to the line in the cup. I thought they meant the top line.
Oh no.
And so, I mean, I went to college I was so dumb. Like, and so, yeah, I blacked out that night, and that was the first of many, 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 many nights. But that the next day, people were like, you are so funny. That was so, like, blah, blah, blah. And it was just like, the attention, and like, I always love a spotlight. Like, and it was just kind of like a flood of dopamine where I was like, ooh, people love it when I am like just kind of like, ooh, I read so crazy, hee hee ha ha. And I think that certainly, it was like I was addicted to the attention at first, and then it became addicted to the substance, if that makes sense.
It definitely makes sense. Like, you kind of associate that, like, okay, when I drink, people like me, and I like it when
Mhm.
people like me, so I'm gonna keep drinking, and like the two just kind of
Exactly.
come together. So, have you noticed, like, I guess growing up, like, you did kind of grow up in a culture that was very like drinking is bad, substances are bad. And I guess now being on this side of
Mhm.
your recovery journey and working in the Chinese community, like have you seen like what are your observations in terms of how people treat you as someone who's in recovery or the conversations that you're having around the topic and that kind of thing?
I think that, I tell people like in a I've told my boss because she's like, oh, she had no idea, she attended an event or she was at that webinar recently where I spoke about my lived experiences, and she messaged me, and said, thank you so much for sharing, we've talked about it a little bit, but I had no idea. And I'm like, I just in college and before, people could tell, they were like, this is a kid who gets wild and like has a good time, like that's the kid who steals a bulldozer at the golf course. And I'm like, yep, that's me. But now I'm like, I'm so much more buttoned up, and at times I do feel like I do miss it because I'm like, man, where did my spark go? Blah blah blah. But then I'm like, there is always that little voice in the back of my mind that's like, man, wouldn't it be so fun to do it again or whatever. Like you did have a lot of really good times, and then I have to remember that the end result of it was not good. It was not a happy place. It was not the though the journey was fun, it was like the destination was really, really bad place.
Yeah.
And so I think the way that people approach me now is that I'm not really sure. Like I'm very open about it. Like I'll tell people like I don't have a lot of shame about it because I'm actually the shame that I felt about the way that I've behaved or like the things that things that I'm not proud of. I'm actually so much more proud of the like growth and maturity that I've gone through since then
Yeah.
that I'm like I'm happy to talk about that because I can share embarrassing stories, but I can also say, but then I also have been able to accomplish this and this and this in spite of all of that, or, and I actually learned a lot about myself. I went through a phase where I was like, okay, I'm going to be completely sober. And then I realized that instead of being sober, I was just isolating myself from everything. I was like, what if there is alcohol there? What if there is this there? And what if I had this really annoying, intrusive thought where I was like, what if I spontaneously get really, really drunk at a social event? I was like, what if it just happens? And like, that was really scary to me.
Yeah.
And now I don't live a sober life. Like I do drink occasionally, like socially, but it is so much more in control. And like, it's no longer I'm going to events for the drink. It's like I'm going to be with friends, and like sometimes I'm like, yeah, I could use one. It's been a long day, and then other times I'm like, no, I'm fine. And
Yeah.
so my relationship with it really changed. But the way that people like approach me or talk to me, it doesn't feel strained or awkward in any way. Actually, as a person in recovery, I think I feel like I can navigate things very neutrally.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting because I think I was not expecting that to be
Hmm.
your answer, right? Like I was kind of expecting that the response would be kind of that judgment, that kind of like,
Hmm.
oh, really? Like you struggled with addiction or that kind of thing. But what I'm hearing from you is that's not the case, right? The reaction seems to be people being like, oh, I didn't know that that was something that you dealt with. And then they
Hmm.
kind of move on, right? Like it's just, okay, like that is a fact of life.
Right. And even kind of to that extent, within UCA Waves, which is a largely Chinese American immigrant space, I think one thing about the AA and HPI community is that there is so much that we hold in our hearts, in our heads, that does not get shared, but we're all, there's such a large community of we are all thinking the same thing, we're all feeling the same thing. We all know someone who feels or thinks the same way or has these experiences, but there's a little bit of a secrecy to it all. And so when I share these things, it does help that UCA Waves is a mental health organization where we are all about destigmatizing. So when I share things, people applaud. And so I think one of the large things is that we know Chinese Americans, we know immigrants we understand that there are struggles. There's a mental health aspect, there's a genetic aspect, there is a social and environmental aspect to it all. So it's never I feel very grateful to be in a space and to have, really somehow navigated my entire recovery journey in a space where people understand that it is not because I'm a flawed person.
Yeah.
It is because I am navigating challenges with, on my own or with seemingly very little external support. And I think we're going to talk about support a little bit later. So I'll hold off on that. But yeah, I feel very lucky to be in a particularly unique space where we are working to destigmatize.
Yeah. And I mean, I think even in the broader space, right? Like most of the conversations that I'm having through Tarang with various communities and various community members, I just keep thinking about like that Spider-Man meme, right? Where we're just like they're
Hmm.
both pointing at each other. And,
Hmm.
there's so many conversations that I'm having with people that are like, I'm sharing some component of my story or some component of someone else's story, and they're saying like same.
Hmm.
And you never would have thought that they would be able to empathize with what is coming out of your mouth. But I think, and that's kind of why I really frame the work that Tarang is doing as safety building, right? Because I
Uh-huh.
don't know how much, to your point, in the hearts and in the minds of so many members of our community, there's what I'm finding is there's not so much judgment. There's not so much like shame, but there is a fear that the other people are going to respond that way, right?
Hmm.
Like everyone's kind of like, no, I know that this is not a failure on your part. I know that this is not something that makes you a bad person, but I don't know if you think that way.
Hmm.
And so we're not having these conversations with each other. We're not being honest with each other. But when someone like you is brave enough to say that, you realize that, wait, no, hold on. We're all just trying our best, you know? Um, so Saisha, for you, you mentioned that your recovery journey was something that you widely did by yourself. And I'm wondering, what did your community do? How did your community factor into that? Is there anything that they did that was particularly helpful in getting to a place of recovery? Or on the flip side, is there anything that they could have done that would have been more like it would have made your journey a little bit easier?
I think definitely, yeah, there's sides to both. I would say my community was primarily the people I met in college, so around my age, that kind of stuff. And I think the biggest thing that was helpful was just, I mean, I guess this is similar to what Reed described in, it's Waves, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
Organization, yeah. Where I think I was pleasantly surprised because no one was really there to sit there and be like, "Oh my goodness, this is so horrible." And I know they'd mentioned like right or wrong very early on in like the last thing, and I like that phrasing because I think at no point in time did anyone try to kind of like antagonize me for my substance use, but they also didn't necessarily um, I don't know. They just took a very like neutral approach to it and were willing to learn. So there were no like, oh, you did this well, you did this badly. It was just, okay, you're where you're at. Um, and obviously you have your goals in mind and like our opinion doesn't matter. So where are you trying to get to and like how can we help you? So I think there was a lot of that, just like not bringing any preconceived notions into the matter and just like completely listening to me and like trying to figure out where I want it to be at the end of the day. And I think that was just like phenomenally done. And especially because I mean, I was like 18 and all of these other people are 18 too. So the fact that, I think, I don't know, people were a lot more mature than I expected them to be, especially at that age. I mean, I think they handled it really well. Um, as far as going differently, I think there was still. I mean, I don't know that I would necessarily say this was like badly done on their end, but I think it can also be a very scary time for other people when you are dealing with a loved one who is facing addiction. So I think occasionally there would be times where I guess like substance use as a term just sounds very intense, right? So to tell someone that you are struggling with substance use just sounds like a very big deal. And in my case, like it relatively was, but I think there were also times where people just like didn't know what to do, which again, to no fault of theirs, but I think sometimes the first reaction they would have is like straight panic, which is never great because it's like I'm also in this situation. I'm also like confused. I don't.
Yeah, you're like, I can't
Yeah,
emotionally take care of you right now.
right. So I think collectively, I think all of us were just so lost on what next steps are. Their intentions were like very awesome. I felt very supported by the people around my age. And yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't think I would have ever expected a time where, especially, I guess, like growing up in my family, where I could interact with other Asians and Asian Americans and kind of talk about substance or mental health primarily, but also substance use, and just have that reaction be overwhelmingly positive. But that was definitely the case.
Did you have a similar experience talking about this like with your parents or with your like community back home?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I, in a way, I mean, I think there's still quite a bit of stigma around it now. And at some point, I definitely like do intend on being a bit more vocal about it, but I think at the moment, they've just kind of started to get around the whole mental health thing because once I got diagnosed with ADHD, like that was a whole nother thing for them, and I got a lot of pushback. So it's like I think I might need to drop it on them one thing at a time. But at some point, yeah, it is my intention to kind of explain the whole situation to them. And yeah, I mean, I think it was difficult for sure, understanding mental health on their end, but they got around to it, and I feel like they are very willing to learn now. So I think when it is an appropriate time to talk to them about substance use, I could see it like going well too, to be honest.
I think that's great. And, what I'm hearing is like when you were struggling, when you needed help, like you didn't feel like you could go to your community, right? Like you couldn't talk to your parents, you couldn't talk to the aunties and uncles, or maybe even your friends growing up, if that's accurate.
Hmm.
Um, so I guess for both of you, what does creating a culture within the Asian American Pacific Islander community that is supportive for substance use and people struggling with substance use disorder, what does that look like to both of you? I guess, Saisha, reflecting on your own experiences, like what would have a community looked like where you felt like you could have gone to your parents or could have gone to like the people that you grew up with, or if you were at a festival and someone offered you a drink and you said no, I'm in recovery, like you felt safe to do that. And I guess reading work, like what are you seeing that could be lending itself towards creating those spaces?
Absolutely. I think um, this might be a little bit of a stretch, but what comes to mind is like the college environment is very um, complicated. There are so many layers of like what its purpose is. It is essentially, in my experience, it was just like a giant pit where we stuck thousands and thousands of 18 to 21-year-olds. And their only goal is to climb out of it by the end, and not and be able to pay off the debt it takes to get out of there. um, and I think what was so challenging for me is that like there were some people that in retrospect I realized that lived on my floor or were within my friend group that were like, hey, I think that maybe you need to do some thinking or like some reflecting because like yeah, you're like crazy fun and very funny and we know that you like to do this, but like you're doing it a lot. You're doing it a lot, and I mean, it's kind of disproportionate to what other people are engaging, like the activities that they're doing, and the frequency is concerning us. So and my initial reaction then was like, you're just jealous. People like me more. Um, but I think that college, and I think also, Asian Americans have there's a stereotype and there's a reputation for like Asian American youth are like very very driven. We the model minority, and it's about where can I get with my skills, like how can I do the best that I can do, which is not a bad thing. College is a place for like self growth and everything, but it's hard to have a community when everybody's so busy climbing up the wall and trying to get up as high as they can that it's difficult when you're climbing yourself to help someone else who
Yeah,
has fallen or who has
build
slipped.
genuine friendships with someone you're competing against.
Exactly, exactly. Competition, and I think that a lot of it is unspoken, and so I think that both within like just college communities, but also within Asian American communities, is that there is a lot of there's friction there, and there doesn't need to be. So that, I don't know how to really close out that thought of mine, but um,
I mean, I think it's interesting because earlier when you were talking about like how you kind of started your recovery journey, you started your recovery journey just by like being by yourself.
yeah.
And in the last podcast, I think it was Marielle, but mentioned the opposite of addiction is connection.
Hmm.
And, you know, I think what you're just talking about how you're seeing other people as competition, right? And I mean, our cultures lend themselves to that, right? Like each parent is talking about like, well, my kid's doing this and my kid's doing that and my kid's doing this. And like, you just constantly feel like you're being like compared to all these other people. And
Hmm.
the reality is like you're only sharing the highlight reels. You're not sharing like the full
Exactly.
story. But how can you find genuine connection and solidarity, especially on some of these more like quote unquote taboo topics or topics that are like more associated with quote unquote failure
Hmm.
when that's just constantly happening? Like, God forbid I talk to like one of my oldest childhood friends about substance use or like my possible challenges with substance use because that's just going to be like oh okay, I'm better than you know, like no, that's not
Hmm. Hmm.
and who is that in service of and who does that benefit, like
Right.
it's just bad all around. um
And it's also it's really hard. It's very easy actually. It's very easy to get into a headspace of telling people and them saying being supportive, but in your mind going, they're just saying that. I know that they're judging me in my mind. They're probably going home and they're saying, oh, bless their heart, you know. Um, and it's very easy to kind of get yourself into those really negative thinking spaces. And I think that that was certainly a couple of a little bit of my recovery journey where it was difficult, where I was like in the very beginning, where I was like, oh my God, like what my turning point in my recovery journey was the result of one single night where it's still very hazy to me, but I don't, I think that my intention was not to wake up the next day. And so but I did. And then I got so sick and I went to the hospital and it was extremely painful.
yeah.
And I realized, wow, that was not fun and I don't like that and we're never going to do that again. And it was just like okay, don't know where my brain took me or where my heart was last night, but we're not going back.
Well,
And so I think that after that, I was like, oh God, like there's probably so much more emotional and mental health things going on underneath the surface that are just kind of like flooded with substance. And so I can't see what's below it. And so that was actually where a lot of the any of the shame or anything came from, because I was like, oh God, I am using this to cover parts of me that are broken. And that was the hardest part.
mm,
Realizing that, that there was other work to be done. And I don't know. I don't believe that I am broken anymore or that I ever was broken. Just saying that.
no, I mean, I thank you for sharing that and thank you for being here. Thank you for doing
Uh-huh.
the work that you need to do to like make sure that you're still here. Because I think that's something that we hear a lot about substance use and substance use disorder is like, mental health and substance use are so correlated, right? And,
Hmm.
very often, like, problematic substance use is either a product of or contributing factor to poor mental health. And if you're only focusing on, okay, I want to have a better relationship with substances, whatever that looks like for you, but you're not talking about the mental health side of things, like, how can you be successful if you're only addressing half the problem?
Hmm.
And, especially even kind of getting the clarity to be able to dive a little bit deeper and realize that, like, oh, I'm using substances because, like, there are things in me that I'm just not ready to deal with. Like, that in and of itself is a journey, right?
Hmm.
So, and it's not easy and it's not particularly fun, right?
Hmm.
But I think, like, that is the price to pay to be able to be here for the people who love you and for the people who are like their life is better because you're part of it, you know?
Hmm.
So Isha, same question for you. Like what would a community, an AAPI community that looks supportive, that makes you feel safe talking about these issues, what does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, I think we briefly, there's two main things for me. I, the first one we like touched up on a little bit earlier, but in a perfect world, I feel like people would understand that we really are just on the same team with all of the issues that we deal with. I think within the Asian community, at least like in my experience, there is a lot of, like we said, like competition between individuals, but there's just so much separation altogether. I mean, I think a lot of Indians feel very isolated from like East Asians, for example. Hell,
Hmm.
even like Indians are separated from different parts of India, so it's like everyone kind of feels like they're, in their own bubble and they're only there to support their own bubble. And I think we need to see a lot more of that outreach amongst all of us, really. Um, and yeah, I mean, yeah, that's pretty much it. I mean, I think just being able to create like a pan-Asian culture, and also I feel like I don't really see too much Pacific Islander representation either. So I think being able to recognize them as one of our own too would just be super lovely because I think the bigger your community is, the better, or like the more people there are to support you, the better it is. And I understand, wanting to like stick to your own culture. I think there's levels of familiarity, but I guess in a perfect world, that division wouldn't be so strict in terms of supportiveness. I also think, our like AAPI communities, I think one of our strongest or one of our biggest strengths is culture and tradition. And I think we continue to, make that very visible and, maintain that throughout like generations, which is lovely. And again, I love being part of the communities that I am. But I think said tradition or said knowledge that we've carried for so long clashes a lot with learning new information sometimes. And I think a lot of people sit there and are kind of in the position where it's like, oh, well, this is the way things have always been done. So why would I want to learn more about different circumstances? And I think those things don't have to clash. I mean, I think they often do because nowhere in the past did it say like, oh, substance use is like frowned upon. That's just not a
It
thing
wasn't.
in our culture. Right, right. And it's also like I'm not even the first one in my family to do it. It has been an issue back then. So it's like I also feel like it's not very productive to keep that fixed mindset where it's like, oh, well, this is history and like it's impossible to keep moving because I think our cultures are like ever evolving. There's always ways to, learn from people, grow as people, that kind of stuff. And I think I would love to see like more education on different topics within our communities. I think that would be really cool. And I think people being more willing to kind of grow, like expand their knowledge of different situations would be lovely amongst the API community.
I love that because, for me, when I move through the world and people ask me, like, what is my ethnicity? What is my identity? I'm Indian American. I'm not Indian. I'm not American. And the reason that I just hold so deeply to that is because so much of my mental health journey has been feeling like I'm not enough when I'm in Indian spaces, when I'm not enough in American spaces. And I can define what Indian American means for me. And that includes having a mental illness, that includes using substances when every once in a while, and on the flip side, like I have very frequently like experienced kind of the conversation when we're talking about a third party who's not present with who's struggling with substance use disorder, where the reaction is like, oh, well, they're Jain, or well, they're Hindu, and like, our religions, we're not supposed to use substances. And like that becomes the focus of the conversation about how, like, well, if they just followed the religion and like, never even exposed themselves to it the way that people did in India when like back in the day, then we wouldn't like, it's not they wouldn't even be here, right? It's almost like, well, it's their fault because they started drinking, they started taking drugs. And it's like, well, that's not the point, right? The point is they're here. It is a very different environment here. The way that alcohol is built into culture in America is very different than the way that alcohol is built into the culture like in India in the 1990s.
Mm-hmm.
And whether they should have or shouldn't have or whatever, we're past that point. How do we have this conversation about this person in a way that centers the fact that they are a person who is deserving of care and love and compassion and support, right? Like it's not even relevant to be talking about what their religion says or this or that, And I think that just, yeah, it's really like, how do we kind of have more freedom or yeah, more freedom from tradition and culture in a way that harms us. We hold on to the things that like resonate with us, but we are able to kind of let go of the things that might not be serving us or quite frankly might be harming the people that we are interacting with or, seeking to engage with. Well, Reed, Saisha, thank you both so much for the conversation and for all of your insights. And to you, thank you for joining us for the final episode in our Tarang series on the Governor's Institute's Addiction Medicine podcast. All of our guests have been absolutely phenomenal through this series, and I want to extend my sincerest gratitude to them for their honesty, insight, and vulnerability. To learn more about Tarang and other initiatives from the Governor's Institute, visit governorsinstitute.org. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Addiction Medicine Essentials starts the conversation. The Addiction Medicine Conference takes it further. Join us virtually for Addiction Medicine Essentials on October 16th through the 17th, 2026. Practical, foundational training designed for professionals across healthcare, behavioral health, and community support systems. Gain real-world tools, fresh perspectives, and strategies you can put to work immediately. Then, join us in Raleigh, North Carolina for the Addiction Medicine Conference, March 18th through the 20th, 2027, North Carolina's premier gathering for clinicians, leaders, and change makers advancing addiction care across the region. 2 experiences, 1 mission. Better care, stronger systems, and healthier communities. Start online, continue in Raleigh. Addiction Medicine Essentials and the Addiction Medicine Conference. Be a part of what's next. Learn more and register at addiction-medicine.org.